In the winter of 1851, two identical men walked into the Medical College of Virginia in Richmond, seeking treatment for what they described as a condition of the mind. Within 6 months, both Thomas and Timothy Henderson would be dead. One found in a state of violent psychosis, clawing at his own flesh until his fingernails broke and bled. The other discovered in complete catatonic withdrawal, staring blankly at nothing while his body slowly wasted away. The attending physician, Dr. Cornelius Hartwell, claimed their deaths were from natural deterioration of mental faculties brought on by hereditary weakness. But when other doctors attempted to review the case files, they discovered something that chilled them to the bone. Every single medical record had been systematically altered, falsified, or destroyed, using methods that suggested deliberate cover-up rather than accidental loss. Dr. Hartwell himself vanished from Richmond exactly 72 hours after the twins' deaths, leaving behind only fragments of what appeared to be detailed experimental notes written in a complex code that no one could decipher. What those notes revealed about human experimentation would force the medical community to make a choice that would echo through generations: expose the truth and destroy public trust in medical science, or bury it forever to protect their profession's reputation and their own careers. They chose silence, but silence has a way of rotting from within, and the truth about what happened to the Henderson twins has been festering in the shadows of American medical history for over 170 years, waiting for someone brave enough to dig up what was meant to stay buried. Before we continue with the story of the Henderson twins and the dark secrets that died with them, make sure you're subscribed to never miss these deep dives into America's most disturbing historical mysteries. And let us know in the comments what state you're listening from. We love hearing from our audience across the country. But to understand what drove two healthy, wealthy men to seek medical help that would ultimately destroy them in the most horrific ways imaginable, we need to go back to where it all began. A tobacco farm outside Richmond, where the Henderson family had built their fortune on the backs of others, and where secrets had a way of festering in the Virginia humidity like infected wounds that never cure. Eat, heal. The Henderson tobacco plantation sprawled across 800 acres of the richest soil in Henrico County, its red earth so fertile that locals claimed you could plant a stick and watch it grow into a tree. 12 miles east of Richmond, the property commanded a view of the James River that curved like a brown snake through the Virginia countryside. In 1850, it was one of the most prosperous agricultural operations in the state, worked by 43 enslaved people whose lives had been reduced to nothing more than numbers in Jeremiah Henderson's meticulously kept ledgers. The wealth that built the Henderson family's 3-story brick mansion, with its white columns and wraparound porches, didn't come solely from tobacco, though that crop provided excellent cover for more lucrative and infinitely more dangerous enterprises. Jeremiah Henderson had discovered that medical schools throughout the South were desperately in need of what he euphemistically called anatomical specimens, cadavers for dissection, skeletal remains for study, and sometimes, when the price was right, living subjects for what physicians termed observational research. The business had started innocently enough. When slaves died from disease, injury, or old age, Jeremiah began selling their bodies to the Medical College of Virginia instead of burying them in the plantation slave cemetery. Dr. William Payne, who taught anatomy at the college, paid $20 for each body in good condition, more money than most plantation owners made from a slave's labor in an entire month. But $20 became $50 when Jeremiah learned to preserve bodies using techniques he'd learned from a disgraced physician who'd fled north after being caught grave robbing in Charleston. Soon, Jeremiah wasn't waiting for natural deaths. Slaves who became too old to work effectively, who showed signs of rebellious behavior, or who simply knew too much about the family's activities would disappear during the night. Their absence was explained as runaways, and forged documents were created to support sales to non-existent buyers in distant states. In reality, their bodies were being prepared for medical education, bringing in profits that dwarfed anything tobacco could provide. Thomas and Timothy Henderson, born on a sweltering August night in 1825 during a thunderstorm that knocked down 3 tobacco barns and killed 2 horses, were identical twins who had grown up knowing they were destined to inherit this empire of moral compromise. By 1850, both men were 25 years old, standing exactly 6 feet tall with lean builds that spoke of good nutrition and easy living. They shared the same dark hair that curled slightly at the collar, the same pale skin that burned quickly in the Virginia sun, and the same cold grey eyes that seemed to reflect light without absorbing warmth. Eyes that servants claimed could look right through a person as if they weren't really there. Thomas, born 7 minutes earlier during the worst of the storm, had always been the more physically aggressive of the two. As children, he had tortured small animals with scientific precision, keeping detailed records of how long it took different creatures to die under various conditions. He was quick to anger and quicker to violence, but his rage was never wild or uncontrolled. Instead, Thomas approached violence the way other men approached business, methodically, efficiently, and always with an eye toward maximum impact. Timothy, born as the storm was finally breaking and the first pale light of dawn touched the horizon, possessed an unsettling calm that most people found far more disturbing than his brother's obvious aggression. Where Thomas would explode into fury, Timothy would simply stare with those grey eyes until whoever had displeased him began to fidget and look away. He had learned early that silence could be more intimidating than shouting, that a quiet threat delivered in conversational tones was far more effective than dramatic pronouncements. The twins had been educated by a succession of private tutors, as was customary for wealthy plantation families, but their education had been anything but conventional. Jeremiah, obsessed with what he called scientific advancement and the pursuit of empirical knowledge, had encouraged his sons to observe and participate in the family's more clandestine activities from an early age. By the time they were 12, both boys had watched their father oversee the systematic murder of troublesome slaves. By 15, they were helping to prepare bodies for sale to medical institutions. By 20, they had moved beyond mere observation to active participation in what Jeremiah called the family business. From childhood, Thomas and Timothy had learned to view human beings as commodities to be bought, sold, and experimented upon. They had watched their father test various poisons on slaves to determine lethal dosages that could be sold to physicians interested in the effects of different substances on human physiology. They had observed surgical procedures performed on living subjects without anesthesia, ostensibly to study pain responses, but really to satisfy the sadistic curiosities of paying medical professionals. Richmond in 1851 was a city caught between the genteel traditions of the Old South and the ambitious scientific aspirations of a new generation of physicians who cared more about advancing medical knowledge than adhering to ethical constraints. The Medical College of Virginia, established just 13 years earlier in 1838, was rapidly gaining a reputation as one of the most progressive institutions in the country. Progressive in terms of being willing to push boundaries that other medical schools avoided out of moral squeamishness. The college occupied the striking Egyptian building on Marshall Street, its unusual architecture making it one of the most recognizable landmarks in Richmond. The building's design, inspired by ancient Egyptian temples, was intended to convey the mysterious and sacred nature of medical knowledge. Its dark stone walls and imposing columns suggested that serious, important work was being conducted within, work that might sometimes require secrecy and discretion. Dr. Cornelius Hartwell had arrived in Richmond in the spring of 1850, carrying impressive credentials from the Philadelphia College of Medicine and bringing with him theories about human behavior that he claimed could revolutionize the practice of medicine. Hartwell was a tall, thin man in his early 40s, with prematurely grey hair and intense blue eyes that seemed to catalogue every detail of whatever they observed. His hands were surgeon-steady, with long fingers that moved with the precision of someone accustomed to delicate work. Hartwell's theories centered on the belief that criminal tendencies, mental illness, moral degeneracy, and even personality traits were not products of environment, upbringing, or personal choice, but rather biological conditions that could be measured, manipulated, and potentially cured through careful application of various chemical substances and behavioral modifications. He had published several papers in obscure medical journals suggesting that the human mind was essentially a complex chemical system that could be adjusted like a clock or tuned like a musical instrument. Most controversially, Hartwell believed that identical twins offered the perfect opportunity to test his theories under controlled conditions. Since twins shared identical physical characteristics, any differences in their responses to experimental treatments could be attributed solely to the interventions themselves, not to individual variations in biology or background. One twin could serve as a control subject, while the other received experimental treatment, providing clear evidence of the treatment's effectiveness. These theories had made Hartwell something of a pariah in Philadelphia medical circles, where his colleagues viewed his ideas as dangerously radical and potentially unethical. But in Richmond, where the medical establishment was younger and more willing to embrace controversial ideas, Hartwell found a receptive audience. The Medical College of Virginia offered him a position as assistant professor of mental medicine and provided him with laboratory space and a modest budget for research materials. What the college administrators didn't know was that Hartwell had been forced to leave Philadelphia after allegations surfaced that he had been conducting unauthorized experiments on patients at the Pennsylvania Hospital for the Insane. While nothing had been proven in court, rumors persisted that several patient deaths could be attributed to Hartwell's experimental treatments. The Philadelphia medical community had quietly encouraged his departure, preferring to avoid a scandal that might damage the reputation of medical education in Pennsylvania. The first indication that something was seriously wrong at the Henderson plantation came on a bitter February morning in 1851, when Timothy Henderson appeared at the front door of the family mansion just as the sun was rising over the frost-covered tobacco fields. He was completely naked despite the freezing temperature, his pale skin mottled blue and purple from the cold. Blood covered his hands and forearms, not his own blood, but still fresh enough to drip steadily onto the white marble steps of the front porch. In his right hand, Timothy carried a long-handled shovel, its metal blade crusted with dirt, and what appeared to be fragments of bone and hair. Deep scratches covered his face and arms, as if he had been fighting his way through thorny underbrush in complete darkness. His grey eyes, normally so focused and calculating, stared straight ahead with a vacant expression that suggested he wasn't entirely aware of his surroundings. Jeremiah Henderson, awakened by the sound of his son pounding on the door with the shovel handle, found Timothy standing motionless on the porch, swaying slightly as if he might collapse at any moment. When questioned about where he had been and what had happened, Timothy could only repeat one phrase over and over in a flat, emotionless voice. "The specimens are walking. The specimens are walking. The specimens are walking." Thomas, roused from sleep by his father's shouts, emerged from the house to find his twin brother in this disturbing condition. For the first time in their lives, Thomas seemed genuinely frightened by something his brother had done. The twins had shared secrets and collaborated in violence many times before, but Timothy's current state suggested something beyond their usual calculated cruelty. It took nearly an hour of searching before Thomas located the source of the blood that covered his brother's hands. In the tobacco drying barn, a large wooden structure about 200 yards from the main house, 3 enslaved workers lay dead in a scene that would haunt Thomas for the rest of his short life. The bodies had been arranged with meticulous care in a grotesque tableau that suggested ritual rather than random violence. Each corpse had been positioned as if seated at the large wooden table where tobacco leaves were normally sorted and graded. Their hands had been placed carefully on the table's surface, fingers spread as if they were examining invisible documents. Most disturbing of all, their eyes had been held open using small twigs inserted behind the eyelids, creating the illusion that the dead men were still alert and watching. The victims were Caesar, a 40-year-old man who supervised the tobacco processing, Benjamin, a younger man known for his skill with horses, and Moses, an elderly slave who had served the Henderson family for over 30 years. All 3 had been killed by massive trauma to the head, delivered with such force that skull fragments were embedded in the wooden walls of the barn. Blood spatter patterns suggested that the killings had been methodical rather than frenzied. Each man had been struck multiple times while the others watched, waiting their turn to die. But the arrangement of the bodies after death required a level of deliberate planning that made the murders even more disturbing. Someone had taken considerable time and effort to position each corpse precisely, adjusting their posture multiple times to achieve the desired effect. Candle stubs scattered around the table suggested that the work had been done by flickering light, adding an element of macabre ceremony to what might otherwise have been simple murder. Timothy had no memory of the killings or the subsequent arrangement of the bodies. When confronted with the physical evidence, the blood on his hands, the shovel he had carried, his obvious presence at the scene, and the lack of any other possible perpetrator, he stared blankly and insisted that he had been asleep in his bed all night. His voice remained flat and emotionless, as if he were discussing the weather rather than multiple murders. Thomas, despite his usual protective instincts toward his twin and their long history of covering for each other's violent behavior, found himself deeply disturbed by his brother's complete lack of emotional response to the accusations. In the past, when they had killed slaves or participated in their father's grisly business, Timothy had always shown some reaction: satisfaction, excitement, even mild disgust. But now he seemed genuinely disconnected from reality, as if the person who had committed these murders was someone else entirely. Jeremiah Henderson, more concerned about protecting the family's reputation and business interests than seeking justice for 3 murdered slaves, made a decision that would prove catastrophic for his entire family. Rather than involve local authorities, who might ask uncomfortable questions about the plantation's activities, he told neighboring plantation owners that the 3 men had run away during the night. This explanation was readily accepted, as slave escapes were common enough that few people bothered to investigate the details. The bodies were hastily buried in unmarked graves on the far edge of the property, in a section of swampy ground where the soil was too poor for tobacco cultivation. Jeremiah burned the blood-stained clothing and spent considerable time cleaning the barn, though dark stains on the wooden walls would remain visible for months afterward. To explain Timothy's condition, the family claimed that he had been injured while trying to prevent the slaves' escape, sustaining his scratches and exposure during a heroic but unsuccessful pursuit through the woods. But the incident had clearly shaken something loose in Timothy's mind, and within days of the murders, he began experiencing what he described as visions of the walking dead. He would sit for hours, staring at empty spaces, occasionally pointing at nothing and whispering about specimens that only he could see. Sleep became impossible. He would pace the halls of the mansion throughout the night, muttering conversations with invisible companions. Thomas, meanwhile, found himself plagued by violent nightmares that grew more vivid and disturbing each night. In his dreams, he witnessed the murders from multiple perspectives, sometimes as Timothy, feeling the shovel connect with flesh and bone, sometimes as one of the victims, watching helplessly as death approached, sometimes as an observer, taking notes on the efficiency of different killing methods. The dreams were so realistic that he often woke up convinced that blood covered his own hands. More troubling still, Thomas began experiencing an increasing urge to replicate what his brother had done. The desire started as simple curiosity about the technical aspects of the murders. How much force would be required to crush a human skull, whether the victims had time to scream, what their final thoughts might have been. But the curiosity gradually evolved into compulsion, a growing need to experience the act of killing for himself. The twins, who had always shared an unusual psychological connection that allowed them to communicate with glances and predict each other's thoughts, seemed to be feeding off each other's deteriorating mental state in ways that neither fully understood. Thomas began carrying a knife at all times, claiming he needed to protect himself from the specimens that Timothy insisted were lurking everywhere on the plantation. Timothy spent hours staring at his hands, convinced they were covered in blood that only he could see, washing them compulsively until the skin cracked and bled from constant scrubbing. As winter grudgingly gave way to spring, and the tobacco seedlings began their first tentative emergence from the Virginia soil, the psychological condition of both Henderson twins continued to deteriorate in parallel patterns that seemed to follow some invisible choreography of madness. Thomas's violent outbursts, which had once been rare and usually triggered by specific provocations, became more frequent and increasingly unpredictable. He would fly into rages over minor inconveniences that had never bothered him before: a servant moving too slowly while serving breakfast, a horse that wouldn't obey quickly enough when he wanted to ride, even the sound of his father's voice, reading the morning newspaper aloud. During these episodes, his physical strength seemed to increase dramatically, as if fury was providing him with energy that his normal physiology couldn't generate. It routinely took 4 grown men to restrain him when he tried to attack a traveling preacher who had come to the plantation seeking donations for a new church in Richmond. The preacher, an elderly Methodist named Reverend Samuel Wickham, had made the mistake of mentioning that all human souls were equal in God's eyes, regardless of race or social station. Thomas had responded by leaping across the parlor and attempting to strangle the man with his bare hands, screaming that some people were nothing more than specimens for experimentation, and that the Reverend was a fool for believing otherwise. The attack was so sudden and vicious that Jeremiah and 3 house servants barely managed to pull Thomas away before he could complete what appeared to be a genuine attempt at murder. Timothy's condition evolved in the opposite direction, but with equal speed and intensity. Where his brother became increasingly explosive, Timothy grew more and more withdrawn, as if he was slowly disappearing from the physical world into some internal landscape that no one else could access. He began speaking only in whispers when he spoke at all, and his conversations became increasingly disconnected from external reality. Servants reported finding Timothy in strange locations throughout the plantation, always standing completely motionless, as if he had been placed there by someone else and forgotten. They would discover him at midnight in the middle of the tobacco fields, staring at the stars with unblinking eyes. Sometimes he would be found sitting in the empty slave quarters where Caesar, Benjamin, and Moses had once lived, positioned in the exact spots where their beds had been. Most disturbingly, he was repeatedly found standing in the tobacco drying barn, in the precise location where the murders had occurred, reaching out to touch invisible objects and carrying on whispered conversations with people who weren't there. When questioned about these nocturnal wanderings, Timothy would claim to have no memory of leaving his room. He insisted that he went to sleep in his own bed each night and woke up there each morning with no awareness of the hours spent wandering the plantation grounds. The servants, already nervous about the February murders and the strange behavior both twins had exhibited since then, began to whisper among themselves about supernatural explanations for Timothy's condition. Jeremiah Henderson, desperate to find some rational explanation for his son's rapidly deteriorating mental state, began consulting with various physicians in Richmond and the surrounding area. Most dismissed the symptoms as temporary mental strain brought on by the isolation of plantation life and the pressures of managing enslaved workers. They recommended travel, perhaps a tour of European medical facilities, or simply more social interaction with people of their own class and background. But Dr. Cornelius Hartwell, when presented with detailed descriptions of the twins' conditions during a chance encounter at a Richmond Medical Society meeting, showed immediate and intense interest that went far beyond professional curiosity. Hartwell listened to Jeremiah's account with the focused attention of a scientist who had just discovered a perfect laboratory specimen, asking probing questions about specific symptoms, the timeline of their development, and the relationship between the twins' conditions. What excited Hartwell most was the apparent symmetry between Thomas and Timothy's psychological deterioration. If one twin was becoming increasingly violent while the other grew more passive, they represented a naturally occurring experiment in behavioral extremes that could provide invaluable data about the biological basis of human personality. The fact that they were identical twins made them even more valuable from a research perspective, since any differences in their mental states could be attributed to psychological rather than physical factors. Hartwell arranged to visit the Henderson plantation on a warm March afternoon, ostensibly to examine the twins and provide medical advice that might help restore them to their previous mental condition. The trip from Richmond took nearly 3 hours by carriage, along roads that became increasingly rough as they moved away from the city. The plantation itself, when Hartwell first saw it through the carriage window, looked like something from a painting. The elegant mansions surrounded by carefully maintained grounds, the geometric precision of the tobacco fields, the neat rows of slave cabins that housed the workers who made such beauty possible. What Hartwell found when he actually examined the twins exceeded his most ambitious expectations. Here were 2 identical subjects displaying perfectly opposite psychological symptoms, with no apparent external cause for their conditions and no family history of mental illness that might confuse the diagnostic picture. During his examination, which lasted nearly 6 hours, he took detailed notes about their physical responses, tested their reflexes with scientific precision, and asked increasingly probing questions about their mental states, their dreams, their fears, and their memories. More importantly, his trained eye noticed something that Jeremiah Henderson had missed despite months of daily observation. Both twins showed subtle but unmistakable signs of chronic exposure to mercury and opium, substances that were sometimes used in medical treatments but could cause severe psychological disturbances when administered in improper dosages or combinations. Their pupils were consistently dilated even in bright light, suggesting ongoing exposure to opium or one of its derivatives. Both exhibited slight tremors in their hands when they thought no one was watching, particularly when asked to perform fine motor tasks like writing or drawing. Most tellingly, both complained of persistent metallic tastes in their mouths and occasional episodes of nausea that seemed unrelated to anything they had eaten. When Hartwell questioned them carefully about their diet, daily routines, and any medications they might have been taking, he discovered that both twins had been consuming food and drink from identical sources for the past several months. Their meals were prepared by the same cook, they drank water from the same well, and they had been taking identical doses of what their father described as tonic medicine, designed to strengthen their constitution and improve their mental clarity. This discovery led Hartwell to a shocking realization. Someone had been systematically poisoning both twins with carefully measured doses of various psychoactive substances, creating the perfect conditions for his experimental theories, while making the subjects believe their symptoms were naturally occurring. Whether this had been done deliberately as part of some existing experiment or accidentally through contaminated medicine, it presented an opportunity that the ambitious doctor could not resist. The twins were already partially prepared for the kind of behavioral modification research that Hartwell had been dreaming of conducting. Their minds had been rendered malleable by months of chemical influence. Their personalities were beginning to fracture along predictable lines, and their family was desperate enough to try any treatment that might restore them to normalcy. All that remained was to convince Jeremiah Henderson that the Medical College of Virginia offered the best hope for his son's recovery. Dr. Hartwell made his formal proposal to Jeremiah Henderson on a warm April evening as they sat in the plantation's library while storm clouds gathered over the tobacco fields outside. The room, lined with leather-bound books that Jeremiah had purchased by the yard to impress visitors, smelled of old paper and the cigar smoke that perpetually clung to the heavy velvet curtains. Through the tall windows they could see lightning flickering in the distance, and the approaching thunder provided an ominous backdrop to their conversation. The twins, Hartwell explained in his most professional and reassuring tone, were exhibiting symptoms that made them ideal candidates for a groundbreaking medical study that he had been planning for over a year. Their conditions, while certainly disturbing to observe, were actually quite fortunate from a scientific perspective because they provided a rare opportunity to study the biological basis of human behavior under controlled conditions. With proper treatment at the Medical College of Virginia, using the most advanced therapeutic techniques available in American medicine, Hartwell believed he could not only cure their psychological disturbances, but also contribute valuable knowledge to the rapidly growing field of mental medicine. The twins would be helping to advance scientific understanding in ways that could benefit thousands of future patients suffering from similar conditions. The treatment protocol, Hartwell explained with the confidence of someone who had already planned every detail, would involve careful administration of various therapeutic substances, combined with detailed observation and documentation of their responses to different interventions. Thomas and Timothy would be housed in comfortable private rooms specifically designed for long-term patient observation, given the best possible medical care available anywhere in the South, and monitored around the clock by trained medical professionals who understood the complexities of mental illness. The study would last approximately 6 months, during which time the twins would be completely isolated from external stresses and distractions that might interfere with their recovery. At the end of this period, Hartwell promised, they would be returned to their family not only cured of their current symptoms, but actually improved beyond their previous mental condition. The experience of participating in advanced medical research would give them insights into human psychology that would make them more effective leaders and decision-makers for the rest of their lives. Jeremiah, desperate to restore his sons to their former selves and intrigued by the possibility that their suffering might contribute to scientific advancement, found himself genuinely excited by Hartwell's proposal. The doctor's credentials were impressive, his explanations sounded thoroughly scientific and rational, and the Medical College of Virginia had an excellent reputation for innovative treatments that other institutions were afraid to attempt. Moreover, Hartwell's explanation that the twins' identical nature made them invaluable for medical research appealed to Jeremiah's sense of his family's importance and social status. Any differences in their responses to treatment could be attributed solely to the therapeutic interventions rather than individual variations in background or biology. The Henderson twins would be contributing to medical knowledge in ways that could benefit humanity for generations to come. What Jeremiah didn't know, and what Hartwell had no intention of revealing, was that the doctor had already diagnosed the true nature of the twins' condition and had no interest in curing them. His real goal was to discover how far he could push human psychology in opposite directions using systematic chemical manipulation, and Thomas and Timothy represented perfect test subjects for the most ambitious experiment of his career. Hartwell had spent months developing a research protocol that would transform the twins into living examples of extreme human behavioral types. Thomas, with his naturally aggressive tendencies enhanced by whatever substances had been affecting him, would receive carefully calibrated treatments designed to eliminate empathy, moral reasoning, and impulse control, while amplifying violent impulses and predatory instincts. Timothy, with his increasing withdrawal from reality, would be given substances intended to create complete mental passivity, suggestibility, and dependence on external authority. The goal was not medical treatment, but rather the creation of two human beings who represented perfect opposites on the spectrum of psychological possibility. One, a completely amoral predator capable of any violence. The other, a completely submissive victim incapable of independent thought or resistance. If successful, the experiment would prove Hartwell's theories about the biological basis of personality and provide him with research data that would establish his reputation as the foremost expert on human behavioral modification. The twins arrived at the Medical College of Virginia on the morning of May 15, 1851, accompanied by their father and two family servants who helped transport their personal belongings and the various medications that Hartwell had prescribed for the journey. The trip from the plantation had taken nearly 4 hours due to heavy spring rains that had turned the roads into treacherous rivers of mud, and by the time they reached Richmond, both Thomas and Timothy appeared exhausted and disoriented. The medical college, housed in the imposing Egyptian building on Marshall Street, had been designed to inspire awe and confidence in both patients and their families. Its massive stone columns and mysterious architectural details suggested ancient wisdom and sacred knowledge, while the building's reputation for housing the most advanced medical research in the South promised that patients would receive treatments unavailable anywhere else in the country. Private rooms on the building's 3rd floor had been specifically designed for long-term patient observation, with features that allowed medical staff to monitor subjects without intruding on their privacy or disrupting their rest. Thomas was assigned to room 312, a spacious chamber with large windows facing east toward the James River. Timothy received room 314, identical in layout but facing west toward the setting sun. Dr. Hartwell's office occupied room 313, conveniently located between his two research subjects, where he could observe both of them at all times. From the moment the twins entered their respective rooms, Hartwell began implementing strict protocols designed to maintain complete separation between them while giving him total control over their environment and experiences. He explained to both the twins and their father that interaction between the brothers might interfere with their individual treatment programs, since their psychological conditions appeared to be influencing each other in ways that could slow or prevent recovery. Complete isolation was necessary for successful treatment, Hartwell insisted, and any contact between Thomas and Timothy during the next 6 months could potentially undo weeks of careful therapeutic progress. Their meals would be prepared separately according to individualized dietary requirements. Their daily routines would be carefully structured to meet their specific medical needs, and their access to visitors, reading material, and even information about each other would be strictly controlled to prevent external influences from complicating their recovery. Jeremiah Henderson, reassured by Hartwell's professional demeanor and detailed explanations, agreed to these restrictions without question. He left his sons in what he believed were the best possible hands, promising to return in 6 months to take them home completely cured. As his carriage disappeared down Marshall Street, heading back toward the plantation, Thomas and Timothy Henderson began their final journey into a hell disguised as medical treatment. Within the first 2 weeks of treatment at the Medical College of Virginia, the differences between Thomas and Timothy Henderson became so dramatically apparent that even casual observers could see that something unprecedented was happening in rooms 312 and 314. The transformation was too rapid and too extreme to be explained by conventional medical treatment, yet Dr. Hartwell's daily reports to the college administration described steady progress toward recovery for both patients. Thomas's violent episodes, which had been frequent but manageable at the plantation, intensified beyond anything his family had ever witnessed. During medical examinations, he would attack doctors and nurses with such sudden ferocity that leather restraints became permanent fixtures in his room, and no medical staff member was allowed to enter without at least 2 armed guards present. His physical strength, already impressive, seemed to increase daily, as if the treatments were somehow enhancing his muscular capacity along with his aggressive impulses. His speech patterns changed dramatically during this period, becoming rapid and disjointed, filled with references to violence and domination that he delivered in conversational tones that made them even more disturbing. He would describe elaborate fantasies about torturing and killing other patients, members of the medical staff, and random strangers with the same casual interest that other people might discuss the weather or their breakfast plans. Most troubling of all, Thomas began claiming that he could see the weakness in other people simply by looking at them. He would stare at visitors and staff members with unblinking intensity, then announce specific methods by which they could be most efficiently killed, as if he were reading their vulnerabilities from their physical appearance. These observations were often disturbingly accurate. He correctly identified a nurse's fear of enclosed spaces, a doctor's weak heart condition, and a guard's injured leg from a childhood accident, despite having no access to information about any of these people. Timothy's transformation moved in precisely the opposite direction with equal speed and intensity. Within days of beginning treatment, he became completely compliant with any instruction given to him, no matter how bizarre or degrading. When doctors asked him to perform humiliating tasks, crawling on the floor like an animal, eating food with his hands while making animal noises, or standing motionless for hours while being poked and prodded, he would comply immediately and without any visible emotional response. His speech slowed to a barely audible whisper that forced listeners to lean close to understand him, and the content of his conversations became increasingly disconnected from external reality. He would respond to questions about his condition by describing elaborate scenarios involving people who didn't exist, places he had never been, and events that had never happened, all delivered in the same flat, emotionless tone. Most unsettling to the medical staff was Timothy's habit of staring directly into people's eyes with an unblinking gaze that seemed to look through them rather than at them. Unlike his brother's predatory stare, Timothy's expression was completely vacant, as if the person behind his eyes had simply disappeared, leaving only a biological mechanism that could respond to external stimuli, but couldn't generate independent thought or emotion. Dr. Hartwell documented every detail of their deterioration with scientific precision that bordered on obsessive. His daily notes, written in a complex coded system that he had developed specifically for this research, recorded their responses to various chemical treatments, their behavioral changes, their sleep patterns, their physical symptoms, and his own theories about the biological mechanisms underlying their transformations. The substances Hartwell was administering went far beyond anything recognized as legitimate medical treatment. Thomas received daily doses of compounds that included mercury, lead acetate, various opium derivatives, and experimental chemicals that Hartwell had obtained through correspondence with European researchers working on what they termed behavioral pharmacology. The goal was to systematically destroy the parts of his brain responsible for empathy, moral reasoning, and impulse control, while enhancing areas associated with aggression and predatory behavior. Timothy's treatment involved different but equally dangerous substances designed to create the opposite effect. His daily medications included heavy doses of morphine combined with experimental sedatives, compounds that affected memory formation, and chemicals that Hartwell believed would make him completely dependent on external authority for even basic decision-making. The objective was to reduce Timothy to a state of complete psychological submission, where he would be incapable of independent thought or resistance to any command. Other medical staff at the college began expressing serious concerns about Hartwell's methods as the twins' conditions became impossible to ignore. Dr. Edmund Carver, who taught anatomy and had 30 years of experience with unusual medical cases, noticed that Hartwell was using substances that were not typically employed in any recognized form of medical treatment. When Carver attempted to review Hartwell's treatment protocols and research notes, he was told that the information was confidential and that outside interference might jeopardize the twins' recovery. Nurse Margaret Wickham, daughter of the Methodist preacher whom Thomas had attacked at the plantation, had been assigned to assist with daily care of both patients. What she witnessed during her shifts, left her deeply traumatized and convinced that something horrific was being disguised as medical research. She began keeping her own private records of the twins' conditions, documenting changes that she believed no legitimate medical treatment could produce. According to her notes, Thomas had begun making detailed plans for killing other patients and staff members, describing specific methods of torture and murder with enthusiasm and technical precision that suggested extensive knowledge of human anatomy. He would explain exactly how to break bones for maximum pain, which arteries to cut for rapid blood loss, and how to keep victims conscious during extended torture sessions. These conversations were delivered in friendly, conversational tones that made them infinitely more disturbing than if he had been ranting or screaming. Timothy, meanwhile, had become so passive that he would not eat, drink, move, or even breathe deeply unless specifically instructed to do so. Nurse Wickham discovered that she could pose Timothy in any position, and he would remain frozen in that exact posture for hours, like a living statue that had been positioned by an artist. His responses to questions became increasingly delayed, as if the words had to travel enormous distances through his mind before reaching the part of his brain capable of formulating replies. The most disturbing aspect of Timothy's condition was his apparent loss of any sense of self-preservation. When accidentally burned by a hot lamp during one examination, he showed no reaction to the pain and made no attempt to move away from the heat source. When deliberately pricked with needles during medical tests, he would watch the blood flow from the wounds with mild curiosity, but no awareness that the injured body was his own. Dr. Carver's concerns about Hartwell's methods reached a crisis point in early September, when he observed the doctor administering substances to both twins that were clearly not medications of any kind. Through careful observation, Carver determined that Thomas was receiving regular injections of what appeared to be concentrated extract from belladonna plants, combined with mercury compounds that were known to cause severe neurological damage. Timothy's treatments involved morphine in dosages that should have been fatal, combined with other substances that Carver couldn't identify but suspected were experimental poisons. When Carver confronted Hartwell directly about these observations, demanding to see official treatment protocols and research approval documents, Hartwell claimed that his methods were based on advanced European research that American physicians were too conservative to understand. The treatments might appear extreme, he explained, but they were producing unprecedented results that would revolutionize the treatment of mental illness throughout the world. Carver's suspicions deepened when he learned that Hartwell had been corresponding extensively with physicians in Germany and Austria who were known for conducting research that violated basic medical ethics. Letters that Carver intercepted suggested that Hartwell was documenting his experiments for publication in European journals that specialized in what they euphemistically called extreme therapeutic interventions. Just when concerns about Hartwell's methods were reaching a critical point among the medical college faculty and several staff members were preparing to formally demand an investigation into his research practices, Timothy Henderson disappeared from his room during the night of October 12, 1851. The circumstances of his disappearance were immediately suspicious to anyone who understood Timothy's actual mental condition. His door was found unlocked the next morning, despite strict policies requiring that patient rooms be secured at all times. His bed appeared to have been slept in, but his personal belongings were undisturbed, and there were no signs of struggle or forced entry. Most puzzling of all, Timothy had left the building during a period when he had been completely incapable of independent action for weeks. Dr. Hartwell's explanation for the disappearance raised more questions than it answered. He claimed that Timothy had mentioned feeling homesick during their last conversation, and had probably attempted to walk back to his family's plantation, despite the fact that the property was 12 miles away, and Timothy had shown no capacity for independent thought or decision-making for months. Hartwell suggested that the treatments had been more successful than anyone realized, and that Timothy had recovered enough mental function to plan and execute an escape. A search of the medical college building and surrounding area revealed no trace of Timothy's whereabouts, though several staff members reported hearing strange sounds coming from the basement storage areas during the night. Metallic scraping noises, muffled voices, and what might have been crying or moaning. When these areas were searched, investigators found nothing unusual, though some noted that certain storage rooms showed signs of recent cleaning and organization that seemed inconsistent with their normal, neglected condition. Thomas's reaction to news of his brother's disappearance was immediate and more terrifying than anything he had displayed during his months of treatment. Upon being told that Timothy was missing, he flew into a rage that lasted for nearly 6 hours, during which he broke every piece of furniture in his room, clawed deep gouges in the wooden walls with his fingernails, and screamed threats against everyone in the building with such specific detail that several staff members requested transfers to other departments. The episode was unlike his previous violent outbursts in both intensity and duration. Thomas seemed to possess superhuman strength during the rage, breaking through leather restraints that should have been impossible for any human being to escape. His threats were not random expressions of anger, but carefully detailed descriptions of exactly what he would do to each person once he was free. How he would track them to their homes, what he would do to their families, and how long he would keep them alive while implementing various torture techniques. When the episode finally ended, Thomas claimed to have no memory of what had occurred and asked repeatedly when he would see his brother again. His voice during these questions was perfectly calm and rational, as if the 6 hours of inhuman fury had never happened. This rapid transition between extreme violence and apparent normalcy convinced several staff members that Thomas was not suffering from any natural mental illness, but had been deliberately transformed into something that could no longer be considered entirely human. The truth about Timothy's disappearance emerged 3 days later, when a maintenance worker named Samuel Potts made a discovery that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Potts had been sent to the medical college's basement storage area to retrieve supplies for a chemistry class when he noticed an unusual odor coming from a room that was normally used to store anatomical specimens for medical education. The smell was unmistakably that of decomposing flesh, but with chemical undertones that suggested some form of preservation process had been attempted. When Potts unlocked the storage room door, he found Timothy Henderson's body positioned on a wooden examination table with such care and precision that it was immediately obvious this was not the result of accident, suicide, or random violence. Timothy's corpse had been arranged in a grotesque parody of a medical examination, with his arms folded across his chest and his legs positioned straight and parallel. His clothing had been removed and folded neatly on a nearby shelf, as if he were simply sleeping and might wake up at any moment. Most disturbing of all, his eyes had been held open using small metal clips of the type normally used to hold specimens during dissection, creating the illusion that he was still alert and observing his surroundings. Medical examination revealed that Timothy had been dead for at least 48 hours. Which meant he had been killed within hours of his supposed disappearance, rather than having escaped and died elsewhere. The cause of death was massive trauma to the brain, but the damage had been inflicted with surgical precision that suggested extensive medical knowledge rather than random violence. Most horrifying of all, Timothy's brain had been completely removed from his skull through an opening that had been carefully cut in the back of his head. The removal had been performed with such skill that the skull remained intact except for the single opening, and the brain tissue had been extracted without damaging any other organs or leaving unnecessary marks on the body. Dr. Hartwell, when confronted with the discovery by college administrators and local police officials, provided an explanation that was transparently false to anyone with medical knowledge. Timothy had suffered a massive seizure in his room during the night, Hartwell claimed, and had died despite immediate medical intervention. The body had been moved to the basement storage area to prevent other patients from being distressed by the sight of death, and Hartwell had been preparing a detailed post-mortem examination when the body was discovered. The missing brain tissue, according to Hartwell's account, had been severely damaged by the seizure and had been removed during a standard autopsy procedure to determine the exact cause of death. He produced hastily written notes that purported to document Timothy's final hours, but the handwriting appeared rushed, and several medical details were inconsistent with established facts about seizure-related deaths. But Nurse Margaret Wickham had been keeping her own careful records of both twins' conditions, and her observations contradicted every aspect of Hartwell's explanation. Timothy had shown no signs of seizure activity during the weeks leading up to his death. Quite the opposite. His neurological responses had been consistently diminished rather than hyperactive. More importantly, she had personally checked on Timothy just hours before his alleged death and had found him in his normal catatonic state, showing no signs of distress or medical emergency. Most damning of all, Wickham had witnessed Dr. Hartwell entering Timothy's room late on the night of his disappearance, carrying a leather medical bag that clinked with the sound of metal instruments and wearing surgical gloves that he normally used only during experimental procedures. She had assumed he was conducting one of his routine examinations, But the timing now seemed far too coincidental to be innocent. When college officials demanded to see Hartwell's complete treatment records for both twins, hoping to understand how Timothy's condition had deteriorated so rapidly, they discovered that most of the documentation had been destroyed or rendered illegible through what appeared to be deliberate water damage. The remaining fragments were written in Hartwell's coded system, but the few sections that could be deciphered painted a picture of systematic torture disguised as medical research. References to behavioral modification through chemical intervention and testing limits of human psychological plasticity suggested experiments that went far beyond any accepted form of medical treatment. Detailed charts tracked the twins' responses to various combinations of toxic substances, with notes about dosage increases designed to push their mental conditions toward predetermined extremes. Most chilling of all were Hartwell's theoretical writings about the possibility of creating perfect specimens of human behavioral types through careful manipulation of brain chemistry. He had clearly viewed Thomas and Timothy not as patients to be cured, but as laboratory animals to be experimented upon until they achieved the psychological characteristics he wanted to study. Thomas Henderson's final psychological breakdown began when he was informed of his twin brother's death by Dr. Carver, who had insisted on delivering the news himself rather than allowing Hartwell to control Thomas's reaction. Thomas's initial response was complete silence. He stared at the wall of his room for nearly an hour without speaking, moving, or even blinking, as if his mind had simply stopped processing information. Then, suddenly and without warning, he began laughing with an intensity that quickly became more frightening than his previous episodes of rage. The laughter continued for hours, interrupted only by periods of violent sobbing and incoherent screaming about the specimens walking again and the doctor's perfect experiment. Staff members could hear his voice echoing through the entire building, and several patients in other rooms became so distressed by the sound that they had to be sedated. During his few remaining coherent moments, Thomas made statements that would haunt everyone who heard them for the rest of their lives. He claimed that Dr. Hartwell had been feeding them medicine that changes what you are inside, and that the treatments had been specifically designed to make one of us into a killer and one of us into a victim. He described watching his own personality disappear as the chemical treatments took effect, feeling himself becoming something monstrous that he couldn't control or understand. Most disturbing of all, Thomas revealed details about Hartwell's experimental methods that had never been officially documented. He described being forced to watch through hidden viewing panels as Timothy was subjected to increasingly brutal procedures, and claimed that Hartwell had been documenting their reactions to witnessing each other's suffering as part of his research into the psychological bonds between identical twins. According to Thomas's testimony, the experiments had been designed not just to modify individual behavior, but to study how psychological torture of one twin would affect the mental state of the other. Hartwell had been deliberately creating trauma in Timothy while observing how Thomas's awareness of his brother's suffering would influence his own violent tendencies. The revelation suggested that both twins had been conscious victims of their treatment rather than passive subjects of medical research, and that their final psychological states had been the intended results of months of systematic torture rather than unexpected side effects of experimental therapy. Thomas Henderson died on October 18, 1851. Exactly 1 week after his brother's body had been discovered in the medical college basement. The official cause of death was listed as acute mental exhaustion leading to cardiac failure. But the attending physicians noted that his final hours were marked by symptoms that were entirely consistent with severe chemical poisoning rather than natural psychological breakdown. His death was preceded by 12 hours of convulsions, during which his body temperature rose to levels that should have been fatal. His heart rate became so rapid that it was impossible to count, and his breathing became so shallow that he appeared to stop breathing entirely for minutes at a time. These symptoms suggested massive organ failure caused by toxic substances rather than the kind of peaceful decline that might be expected from mental exhaustion. Thomas's last words, spoken to Nurse Margaret Wickham just before he lost consciousness for the final time, were delivered with perfect clarity despite his physical distress. Tell them what the doctor made us into. Tell them we were people before he started changing us. Tell them the specimens were walking because he made them walk. Dr. Cornelius Hartwell vanished from Richmond exactly 72 hours after Thomas's death, leaving behind only a brief resignation letter, claiming that he had been called away by a family emergency in Philadelphia that required his immediate attention. When college officials attempted to contact him for clarification about the Henderson case and to request his assistance with the investigation into the twins' deaths, they discovered that no record of his supposed Philadelphia credentials could be verified. The medical school that had allegedly trained him had no record of his attendance. The hospital where he claimed to have conducted previous research had never heard of him, and the family emergency that he had cited as his reason for leaving proved to be entirely fictitious. Even more disturbing, inquiry letters sent to colleagues in other cities revealed that several institutions had experienced similar mysterious disappearances of experimental patients during periods when someone matching Hartwell's description had been on their staff. A thorough search of Hartwell's office and laboratory space revealed the true scope of his experimental activities and confirmed the worst fears of everyone who had suspected that his treatment methods were not legitimate medical practices. Hidden beneath loose floorboards were detailed notes describing months of systematic chemical manipulation designed to transform the Henderson twins into what he called perfect examples of human behavioral extremes. The notes, written in multiple coded systems that took weeks to decipher, revealed that Thomas had been given carefully calculated combinations of mercury, lead compounds, belladonna extract, and various experimental stimulants designed to eliminate empathy and moral reasoning while enhancing aggressive impulses and predatory instincts. The goal had been to create a human being capable of unlimited violence without psychological restraint. Timothy's treatment had involved equally dangerous substances administered in combinations intended to destroy independent thought and create complete psychological dependence on external authority. Morphine, experimental sedatives, and compounds that affected memory formation had been used to reduce him to a state where he could not function without constant direction from others. Most chilling of all, the notes revealed that the Henderson twins had not been Hartwell's first experimental subjects. References to previous cases suggested that he had been conducting similar experiments for years, using patients from various medical institutions across the country. The twins represented his most ambitious attempt to demonstrate that human personality could be completely reconstructed through chemical means, but they were part of a larger pattern of systematic abuse that had been disguised as legitimate medical research. The notes also contained detailed observations about the psychological effects of forcing identical twins to witness each other's suffering, suggesting that Hartwell had been studying not just individual responses to chemical manipulation, but also the emotional bonds between family members. He had deliberately arranged for Thomas and Timothy to be aware of each other's deteriorating conditions, using their mutual concern as an additional source of psychological trauma that would enhance the effects of his chemical treatments. College administrators faced an impossible choice that would determine the future of medical education in Virginia and potentially throughout the South. They could expose Hartwell's crimes and provide full documentation of his experimental methods, which would result in justice for the Henderson family, but might also destroy public trust in medical institutions and end careers of faculty members who had failed to prevent the abuse. Alternatively, they could bury the evidence and hope that such horrors would never be repeated, protecting the reputation of the Medical College of Virginia and the broader medical establishment, while ensuring that Hartwell's victims would never receive justice or recognition for their suffering. After weeks of private deliberation and consultation with influential community leaders, they chose silence. All remaining documentation of the Henderson case was sealed in the college archives, with instructions that it could not be accessed without written permission from at least 3 senior faculty members. The basement room where Timothy's body had been discovered was permanently sealed, with official records stating that structural damage made it unsafe for continued use. Staff members who had witnessed aspects of Hartwell's experiments were required to sign legal agreements promising never to discuss what they had observed, with violation of these agreements punishable by immediate termination and criminal prosecution for breach of confidentiality. Several staff members, including Nurse Margaret Wickham, chose to leave the medical college entirely, rather than remain silent about what they had witnessed. Jeremiah Henderson was provided with a carefully sanitized version of events that portrayed his sons as victims of a rare hereditary condition that caused rapid mental deterioration, followed by death. He was told that the medical college had done everything possible to treat their condition, but that their illness had been too advanced for even the most sophisticated medical interventions to be effective. The bodies of Thomas and Timothy were returned to the Henderson plantation, where they were buried in the family cemetery with elaborate headstones that read, "Beloved sons, taken too soon by God's will." Jeremiah never learned the true circumstances of their deaths, though he noticed that several items were missing from their personal effects when their belongings were returned to the family. But the silence imposed by the medical college could not entirely contain the horror of what had happened in rooms 312 and 314 of the Egyptian building. Nurse Margaret Wickham, despite her signed confidentiality agreement, told her sister about the experiments before leaving Richmond permanently to work at a hospital in Baltimore. Dr. Edmund Carver, troubled by his failure to intervene more aggressively when he first suspected that Hartwell's methods were unethical, made coded references to the case in his personal journals that were discovered years after his death. Maintenance workers who had helped clean Hartwell's office and laboratory spaces whispered among themselves about the disturbing equipment and chemical supplies they had discovered there. Guards who had been required to restrain Thomas during his violent episodes told their families about the inhuman strength he had displayed and the terrifying things he had said about what was being done to him and his brother. Over the years, these whispers would occasionally surface in medical circles throughout Virginia and neighboring states, always quickly suppressed, but never entirely forgotten. The case of the Henderson twins became a cautionary tale that was shared quietly among physicians who were concerned about the ethical boundaries of medical research, a reminder of what could happen when scientific ambition was not tempered by moral restraint and professional oversight. The story took on additional layers of complexity as former medical students and faculty members shared fragments of information with colleagues at other institutions. Each telling added new details or emphasized different aspects of the case until it became difficult to separate verified facts from speculation and legend. Some versions focused on Hartwell's experimental methods, others on the twins' psychological deterioration, and still others on the institutional cover-up that had prevented proper investigation of the crimes. By the 1880s, the case had become part of the informal oral history of American medical education, referenced in private conversations whenever physicians discussed the importance of ethical oversight and the potential dangers of unregulated human experimentation. Medical schools began developing more stringent protocols for approving research involving human subjects, though these changes were implemented quietly without explicit reference to the Henderson case. Today, more than 170 years after Thomas and Timothy Henderson died in the Egyptian building, the Medical College of Virginia still operates as part of Virginia Commonwealth University's medical campus. The building where they suffered and died continues to house medical education, though the third-floor rooms where they spent their final months have been converted to storage space that few people are authorized to access. Official records of the Henderson case remain sealed in the university archives, accessible only to researchers who can demonstrate legitimate academic purposes and who agree to strict limitations on how any information they discover can be used or shared. The few scholars who have been granted access report that many crucial documents appear to have been removed or destroyed, leaving only fragments that raise more questions than they answer. The basement room where Timothy's body was discovered has never been reopened, despite numerous renovation projects that have updated other parts of the building. Construction workers who have worked on adjacent areas report strange sounds coming from that sealed section. Metallic scraping that sounds like surgical instruments being prepared, muffled voices that might be coming from old ventilation systems, and occasionally what sounds like sobbing or laughter echoing through the walls. Security guards who work night shifts in the Egyptian building have reported unusual incidents that they are instructed not to discuss with anyone outside the university administration. Doors that are found unlocked despite being secured the previous evening, lights that turn on and off in patterns that don't correspond to any electrical system, and temperature fluctuations in specific areas that cannot be explained by the building's heating and cooling systems. Most disturbing of all are the reports from medical students and faculty members who claim to have seen figures in the third-floor hallways during late-evening study sessions. Two identical men in 19th-century clothing who appear briefly in peripheral vision but disappear when observed directly. These sightings are always dismissed as stress-related hallucinations brought on by the demanding nature of medical education, but they occur with sufficient frequency that many people now avoid working alone in the building after dark. The Henderson family plantation still exists, though it has changed ownership several times since Jeremiah's death in 1867. The current owners, who operate it as a historical tourism site, are unaware of the connection between their property and the medical college case. The family cemetery where Thomas and Timothy are buried has become overgrown with Virginia creeper and wild honeysuckle, and their elaborate headstones are barely visible through the vegetation. Local historians have occasionally attempted to research the Henderson family's history, but they consistently encounter obstacles that suggest someone is still working to keep certain information from becoming public knowledge. Genealogical records that should exist are missing from courthouse files. Newspaper archives from the 1850s are incomplete in ways that seem suspicious, and family documents that might shed light on the case appear to have been systematically removed from libraries and historical societies. The most persistent researcher, Dr. Sarah Collins of the Virginia Historical Society, spent 15 years trying to piece together the complete story of the Henderson twins before abandoning her work in 2018. In her final report, she noted that the level of systematic evidence removal suggests institutional involvement that has continued for generations, implying that whatever happened to Thomas and Timothy Henderson was significant enough that powerful people still consider it worth hiding. What do you think of this story? Do you believe such experiments could have really happened in 1851, when medical regulation was minimal and human rights protections were virtually non-existent? The techniques that Dr. Hartwell allegedly used were theoretically possible with the chemical knowledge available in the mid-19th century, and the institutional cover-up reflects patterns that we know occurred in other historical cases of medical abuse. Leave your comment below about whether you think the Henderson twins were real victims of medical experimentation, or if this represents the kind of horror story that grows out of legitimate historical fears about unregulated scientific research. Do you believe that evidence of such cases might still be hidden in medical archives around the country, waiting to be discovered by researchers brave enough to ask the right questions? If you found this investigation as disturbing and compelling as we did, subscribe to our channel to never miss our deep dives into America's darkest historical secrets. Hit that notification bell so you'll know immediately when we release new content, and share this video with someone who appreciates mysteries that make you question what really happened in our past. The truth about human experimentation in American medical history has always been more horrifying than fiction. And sometimes the most terrifying stories are the ones that institutions refuse to acknowledge ever happened. Remember, the boundary between historical fact and historical fiction can be surprisingly thin, especially when powerful institutions have reasons to keep certain truths buried. The Henderson twins may be gone, but their story serves as a reminder that the price of scientific progress has sometimes been paid by people who never consented to become part of history's darkest experiments.